with your head.
Reel it in. He's got one. Reel it in, son.
Reel it in.
Hold your hand by that trigger.
I got it.
Keep reeling it. Keep reeling it. Good boy. Oh my gosh. Look at it jumping.
I got it.
Reel it in.
Keep going.
Back up. Now back up. Walk backwards.
Kason, walk backwards.
Walk over that way because you got him hung in the bushes. Reel it in. Now back up.
Help me.
I will if you'll back up. I want you to do it by yourself.
Back up, Kason.
Ooh.
Yay,
Did you video all of
This
it?
is your first catch. You're my first catch. Now it's your turn to get
Hold him now.
a picture of it.
Let go of your rod. Hold him.
Good boy.
Hold him like this.
That's
Hold it-
how a
hold it
man
tight.
holds it. That's
Grab
how
a hold of
man
it tight.
holds it.
Just like that. And look at mama.
That's how a man holds it.
Look at mama. Look at mama.
Oh,
I mean, the question is there anything more satisfying in life than doing what you were created to do? I mean, I want you to think about the fact if you were a fisherman, you were growing up in a fisherman's family, and like this kid, for the very first time, he takes a little bitty rod and reel, pretty much just a toy, right? And he throws it out there. And somehow, by the luck of the day, he ends up with a fish on the end. And that time, this was the first time that this kid had ever caught anything, had ever felt the snag of a fish on the end of his rod and reel. And there was nothing more pure than the excitement on his face, right? The giggle of his laugh of when he finally caught a fish for the very first time. I mean, if you've ever fished before, then you know what that feels like, right? You know what it feels like to do something that you love and are so passionate about. Well, today we're going to be talking about purpose. What your purpose in life is and what my purpose in life is, and more importantly, what our purpose in life is as a Christian. And just like that kid, when we talk about that there's nothing more exciting than for the first time doing and finishing what he was created to do. Like he wanted to fish, and so he threw his pole out there with bait on it, and he ended up catching a fish. And there was nothing more pure than his joy and excitement of catching a fish that day. I posit to you that there's nothing more satisfying in your life than doing what it is that the Lord has called you to do. Now, unfortunately, we live in a world that tries to define for us what purpose is. And so it makes us ask questions. Am I doing what I was called to do, or am I doing the thing that gives me the most amount of money? Is my purpose defined by having the perfect job, or the right amount of kids and the perfect family, or the right, correct amount of education? You see, is my purpose defined by the amount of stuff that I have? As long as I have that house or those vehicles or the right amount of clothes, then I must be doing things right. Or is my purpose defined for me in how God defines our purpose? You see, today, I believe that the Bible is very specific. And in a sense, it may be too simple, what I'm going to posit to you today. Because I believe that when it comes to our purpose, as a believer, as a Christian, a believer in Jesus, I believe that there are only two options. You are either bringing people into a relationship with Christ, or you are pushing people away in their relationship with Christ. And God has created you for the first. He has created you as a believer in Him, as a Christian, to be bringing people into a closer and deeper relationship with Jesus. And so today, that's the question that we're going to start with, and that's the question that we're going to end with. Are you living a life on purpose? Are you bringing people closer and deeper in their relationship with Jesus? And if the answer is yes, then we rejoice with that. We want to encourage that. We want to help deepen that in whatever we can, in whatever ways we can as a church. But if the answer is no, then the question is, are you pushing people away from Jesus? And to look at this and to talk about this today, we're going to look at the end of Mark chapter 9. It's a pretty forthright passage. It's a pretty vivid passage. And today, I hope and I pray that the word of the Lord speaks to you to live a life on purpose, to live a life that values bringing people to Christ. So if you will you turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 9, and I'm going to read the whole passage that we're going to work with today. It's verses 42 through 50. And we're going to talk about 3 different ways that your life can be on purpose in terms of bringing people to Christ. Mark chapter 9, verse 42. And if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone tied around his neck. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, because it is better for you to enter life maimed than with 2 hands to go into hell, where the fire never goes out. And if your foot causes you to sin, then cut it off, because it is better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, then by all means pluck it out, because it is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into hell, where it says that their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? So therefore, have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. You see, last week we talked about the idea of what it looks like to redefine what the world says about greatness. And the world has this view about greatness, but then there's the kingdom of God. This is the idea that Jesus is continually talking about and preaching over and over. And today, instead of redefining our view about greatness from a kingdom view and a world view about greatness, today we're going to talk about purpose. A kingdom view of what it looks like to live on purpose versus a world view of what the world says our purpose in life is. And today, the very first sentence here is one of the most important ones. And so, right out of the bat, Jesus makes it very clear here that we have a purpose and a responsibility for children. And you see, this is so important that look at the language that he uses as I read it one more time in chapter 9, verse 42. The very first sentence here, it says, if anyone causes these little ones who believe in me to sin, then it would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone tied around his neck. You see, God is making it very clear that we have a responsibility as believers in Jesus towards children. And so much of our life, really as parents, revolves around doing things physically to help those children mature. And so our first responsibility as children are to your children, to your individual biological children. It's so important that we have a mentality as parents that is not just the physical raising and maturity of those children, but towards the spiritual nourishment of children. Unfortunately, statistics show us that the number is really at age 15. Because if a child has not made a commitment to the Lord Jesus by the time that child's age 15, reaches the age of 15, that it is more than 10 times unlikely throughout the rest of their life that they're going to follow Jesus. You see, there's a very small window in the life of a child. It may seem long while you have children, but it is a very short and a very small window of molding and helping encourage that child into a relationship with Jesus and ultimately to grow in their relationship with Jesus. Because if we don't do that, then it becomes exceedingly harder in the world that we live in for those children to make a decision to follow Jesus. You see, first and foremost, as a parent, it doesn't matter who else you're wanting to disciple. It doesn't matter who else you're wanting to help grow in a relationship with Jesus. First and foremost, as a parent, your responsibility is to bring your children into a relationship with Jesus. Now the question is, how do you do that? Because we all know that you ultimately can't make your children commit their life to the Lord. And so we do it the same way that we do it with any other role of discipleship in our life. We do it by being a model in a relationship with Jesus. You see, as you model what it looks like to relate and to love and to walk closer and to walk deeper, as you model that for your children, then that is the greatest thing that you can do for your children, to be able to see what it looks like to be in a relationship with the Lord. The more we try to push on our children that they have to go to church, that they have to do this and they have to do that, so many times we push them away from a relationship with the Lord. So instead, how important is it for us as parents to model for children what it looks like to follow the Lord? You see, he makes it very clear here that as believers, that as followers of Jesus, our first and our foremost, really, of priorities when it comes to discipleship and it comes to our purpose in life is firstly to children. Because it is so easy for children to be manipulated off of the track of wanting to follow Jesus. You see, children have so many other alternatives. They have so many other things and people and ideas and the world telling them so many other things than to follow Jesus with their whole life. And so it's an uphill battle. It may feel like an impossible battle, but it's the call that you are called to if you're a parent. To not only raise your child physically and to provide the things of this world that they need in this life, but equally of importance is to model for them how to push them, how to grow them deeper into a relationship with the Lord. You see, there's not a greater calling in this world. There's not a greater purpose that you could enjoy in this world like that kid who for the first time throws that rod and that reel out there. He catches a fish. If you remember back in Mark chapter 1, early on, Jesus calls the disciples and he says, listen, I'm going to make you more than just somebody who catches fish out of the water. I'm going to make you into a man who becomes a fisher of men. And you guys, there's no better feeling, there's no greater sense of satisfaction than getting to be a parent and ultimately investing in that child's spiritual well-being and seeing that child come into a relationship with the Lord and then getting the opportunity to see that child grow in their relationship with the Lord and see them serve the Lord for the length of their life. You see, there's nothing greater as a parent Your child can have the best jobs or go to the best schools or any of all those things, but there's nothing greater than getting a chance to encourage your child to follow Jesus. So first and foremost, we have a responsibility to our children. And then secondly, we, as believers in Jesus, have a responsibility to all children of the world. There are so many children in this community, in this county, that don't have the gift, really, of parents, that don't have the gift of men and women in their life who want to encourage them to follow Jesus. And in a sense, there's nothing you can really do about that. But what you can do is that you can be a man or a woman who helps encourage those children in different ways to follow Jesus. You see, guys, this is the question that we as a church have to vividly and avidly struggle with. You see, if Jesus is so concerned, which he was last week, if you remember the passage we looked at, and then it carries over into this week, if Jesus has a heart for children, then the question is, are we doing all that we can as a church to put a heart for children out there? Because if Jesus is for children coming to a knowledge of himself, and ultimately for following him and growing in a deeper walk and a relationship with him, then there has to be some kind of connection in our church that says we want to grow children in their faith with the Lord. Because there's no doubt if you walk around our community, if you spend time in our schools and in our school district, that there are plenty of kids who are ultimately not in a relationship with the Lord. And when it comes to the responsibility of helping children grow in their relationship with the Lord, it is the responsibility of the believer. And so if you want to follow Jesus and you want to be on a purpose, on a mission for him, then that mission has to be directly connected with children. Because there's no doubt that the heart of the Lord is directly connected with children of the world. You know, and finally, one of the last thing that I think about when it comes to this verse and just the severity and just the strong language here that he uses, that it's important that we don't push children away from following Jesus, but that we help encourage and bring them closer and deeper in their relationship with Jesus. If you remember last week when we talked about his idea of children, we talked about his idea of those who are second class. And a child of that day would have represented somebody in the culture that they wouldn't care about. And so when we look at this passage and we say that if anyone causes somebody who is second class to believe in me to sin, it would be better for us to be thrown into a sea with a large millstone tied around our neck. You see, how we look at and how we view those in our culture who are second class will tell us how we view and what our relationship with Jesus looks like. You know, it's so important that we, as believers in Jesus, want to help push people into a relationship with Jesus instead of being men and women who push people away from Jesus. You see, look, let's go on to the next point. And the next point in verses 43 through 49 is the illustration that your life matters, and it matters far more than you could ever even imagine. This is where he says that if your hand causes you to sin, then it's better to cut off that one hand, because even though you'll enter into eternity with only one hand, it's better for you to enter with one hand than ultimately to not enter at all. And this, in connection with what we just talked about in verse 42, it's better for you to enter with only one hand than to cause somebody else to stumble and not get a chance to enter it all? You see, it's so important when it comes to our lives, whether it's our hands or our eyes or our feet, when it comes to who we are and what we do in our life, what you do, it matters. What you say matters. How you live and interact with people, it matters. You see, when I was a young kid, my parents and I, we used to go up into the mountains and we used to camp. We'd spend some time camping. And one of my favorite things to do would be to ride on the back of the four-wheeler early in the morning, and we would take these trails up into the top of the mountains. And if you've ever been into the Rocky Mountains, you know that at the top of the mountains, most of the time, there are these crystal clear, absolutely beautiful pieces of water. They'd almost be called lakes because they're big enough. But we would pull up to the side, and right on the edge there were these really, what I thought were almost perfect pebbles to throw. And so I'd hop off the four-wheeler, and we would take a break and stretch our legs. And the thing that was most fun for me to do would be to grab that pebble and to bend over and get as close to the ground as possible, and to sling back and to sling it through, and to see how many times I could skip that rock on that water. You see, the water was glistening, absolutely perfect. There wasn't boats on the water. There weren't different things that were causing the water to have ripples or anything on it. And so when you would throw it across and you could get 5, 6, 7 ripples in the water, then all of a sudden all of those ripples would ultimately move out in the water. And all it took was one small pebble and one little bitty kid to throw it out in the water, and it would basically interrupt all of the beauty that was on top of the water. Something I enjoyed a lot. And you know, when I think about my life and I think about your life, I think that God makes it very clear that you have an effect in your life that far reaches much further than you could ever imagine. Your life is like that stone going across the water that sends out ripples farther than you could ever imagine. And Jesus is making it very clear here that whatever your temptation is, whatever it is in your life that is wanting to cause you to sin, it is so important that you identify what that temptation is, what that desire for you is in your life to sin, because your sin causes problems not just for you, but for those who are around you. And you don't ever really know how many people are looking and are watching and are taking in the things that you have in your life. And so he makes it clear here that it is better for us to get rid of that temptation. And sometimes the only way to do that is to metaphorically take off your hand, or to take off your eye, or to take off your foot, because you will still have life, but you will no longer be causing those who are around you to fall into sin. You see, our life on purpose, on a mission, is to bring people closer and deeper in a relationship with Jesus. And so often our life, when it's caught up in sin, even though it may be a small sin, even though it may be the same sin that everybody else in the world is caught up in, but when that happens, ultimately your life is pushing people away from Christ. And so he makes it very clear here that what are you going to do with your life and the life that you're living when it's caught up in sin? Because your sin not only affects you, but it affects those who are around you. It affects your family. It affects your marriage. It affects your relationships at work. It affects anything and everything that you're a part of. And God has given you a mission to bring people closer and deeper in their relationship with Jesus. You see, this verse right here is pretty well connected to the same idea if you'll turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And this is the Apostle Paul here. I'm going to read chapter 9, verses 19 through 22. And Paul says, though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, in order to win as many people as possible. To the Jews I become like a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those who are under the law, I become like one under the law, though I myself am no longer under the law, so as to win those who are under the law. And to those who don't have the law, I become like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those having not been under the law. To the weak I become the weak, in order to win the weak. And I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. You see, Paul knew very clearly what it looked like to live a life that was on mission, on purpose, to help people grow and come into a relationship with Jesus. He understood that salvation is an experience that's only experienced by grace through faith in Christ, and that when that happens, that there is a freedom that comes into our life. But he also understood that in order to win people, you see, the purpose of our life is to help win people to Jesus. He understood that to do that Paul had to put himself in a lifestyle and situations so that that could be possible. You see, I get the question all the time, is drinking alcohol right or wrong? And if you look at this passage and you look at the passage that we just looked at in Mark chapter 9, I'm not going to say that drinking alcohol is right or wrong. The real question is you drinking alcohol going to cause somebody to be pushed away from Christ? Or is it going to cause somebody to come closer to Christ? Because you see, there's so many things like that in our life that the question is not, is it right or is it wrong? The question is it going to cause somebody to be pushed farther from Christ or to be pushed closer to Christ? And I would hope and I would pray that you would put yourself in situations so that you could do all things for all people so that you might win some. And if you're in situations that are detracting from the gospel, if you're in situations that are causing people to wonder what it looks like to be a Christian, if we are causing people to wonder who God is, and if that was the case, then why did he do that? If we're putting ourselves in those type of situations and we are causing other men and other women and other children to wonder if they even want to be a follower of Jesus, then I would say that we are not living out our God-given purpose, which is to push people, to encourage people, to help people along in their journey to meet Christ. One of the things I want you to think about is, who are those people in your life that modeled for you, that encouraged you to want to come to know the Lord? You see, we've all had those people, whether it was one person or multiple people, who you were in that process. You were on the edge of whether or not to make that decision. And those people stepped into your life and they encouraged you. They pushed you. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe it was a parent or a grandparent or a teacher at school. Maybe it was a Sunday school teacher. I don't know who it was, but those people in your life who helped encourage you and pushing you to make a commitment to follow Jesus. Those are people that I imagine that you look up to, that you respect. And I would hope that you would want to be those type of people in the life of those who are looking at you. I would hope and I would pray that people would not look at my life and say, he causes me to sin. Is your life pushing people to Christ, or is it pushing people away from Christ? You see, the very last verse here is so rich in verse 50, because look at what it says as we look at this last point. He says that salt is good. And you see what's unique about this is there are 4 times in the verses prior to this where Jesus makes it very important that he is about better. It is better. And he repeats that. He says it is better, it is better, it is better. And he says that salt is good. And he does that so that you will open your ears and listen to what he has to say about salt, because he says that salt alone is good. But if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Therefore, have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. You see, up to this point, he's talked about the negative side of pushing people away from Christ. And here he makes it very clear that we, as Christians, have a ministry of reconciliation. We have a ministry of living at peace with one another. This is the same idea found in Romans chapter 12, which is a very difficult passage for us as believers to look at, because he makes it very clear there that you are responsible to live at peace as much as you are responsible for. That means no matter what you can do, if you can do it, then you are called to live at peace with everybody. And you see, this idea of peace is the illustration of the gospel, because there is a brokenness between the human race and God the Father because of sin. And to offer peace in that relationship, that gap in that relationship is offered only through the Son, being Jesus himself. And so he came to offer peace in the broken relationship between mankind and God the Father. And he now gives you the same gift of offering peace. And he does that by calling you to live in this world at peace with one another. Now, I imagine you have not been living under a rock for the last 2 or 3 days. And so you have seen many of the terrible things that have been happening within the news, specifically in Virginia. And so as we take a moment just to think about that, and we look at and we think about the idea of racism, we look and think about the idea of casting judgment or white supremacy or any of the things that are wrapped around the culture of what's happening out there. Every single one of those is 100% anti-gospel and anti-Jesus. Because the problem is when you and I look at people differently for whatever reason, when you and I cast judgment on people for whatever reason, whether it be their skin color, their education levels, their materialistic stances, their political views, for any reason, when you and I cast judgment on people, then we are doing the exact opposite of living a life of peace. And you see, Jesus makes it very clear that we are on mission to reconcile people to the Father. And instead, so much of our life ends up being a life that pushes people away from wanting to be in a relationship with the Lord. And Jesus makes it very clear the severity and the intensity of which he wants you to live on mission, the mission that he's called you to. Aren't you glad that Jesus brings peace in your life so that you, a broken, fallen, sinful creature, can have relationship with a God who is perfect and holy? Aren't you glad that Jesus stepped out of heaven and stepped into your life, and he brings forgiveness for you in your broken relationship with the Father? If that is something that is good news for you, that is so exciting and that's so enriching and satisfying for your life, then I pray out of the overflow of that kind of emotion that you would live a life that has a desire to bring other people into that same relationship. That you would have a desire to minister to and to love children. So that in that small window of the moldable, the time of greatest moldability in their life, that you would have an impact. Not just for physical growth, but for spiritual growth. And that your life would be about seeing people come to Jesus. You know, I think back to the video that I showed you at the beginning. That moment when you, in your life, take your rod and reel and you bait your hook and you throw it out there into the water and you're fishing. But that moment that you finally catch your first fish, or you catch any fish, and you reel him in, and you bring him up on the bank, and that satisfaction that you get from doing what you were called to do, guys, I promise you, there is no greater satisfaction in this life than being a fisher of men and women and boys and children, and helping encourage people grow in their relationship with the Lord. There is no greater purpose in this life, and when you do it, you will find the greatest satisfaction, greater than any other satisfaction you'll find in this life. Because it's what God has gifted you, it's what God has called you to, and it's what God desires from your life and from my life. So the question as we finish up today is your life bringing people into relationship with Jesus? Or is your life pushing people away from Jesus?